Laser fire tore through the void of space like a hail of death as the human fighter pilot Chris Adams dove his antiquated ship through a swarm of sleek Vorkarian vessels. Chris gripped the controls. Sweat poured down his face inside the helmet. He jerked the ship into a barrel roll, narrowly dodging a salvo of plasma bolts that sizzled past his cockpit. Alarms blared. The humans were desperately outnumbered. Vorkarian ships descended on the defenseless colony world of Kepler-62F, disgorging streams of fighters and dropships like angry hornets from a kicked nest. But the humans of Kepler-62F were tough, gritty, hardened by the unforgiving frontier, and they did not intend to go down without a fight. Chris leveled out, sighted a Vorkarian fighter in his crosshairs and squeezed the trigger. His cannons roared. The enemy ship disintegrated into a plume of flame and shrapnel. 1 down, 1,000 to go. The odds were grim. But Chris and his fellow pilots fought like men and women possessed, men and women with nothing to lose. They tore into the Vorkarian formations with the savage desperation of cornered animals, pulling off maneuvers that defied physics and belief. Against all odds, they repelled the Vorkarian assault that day. The colony survived, but at a terrible cost. The devastated humans buried their dead and licked their wounds, unaware that their victory had just lit the spark that would ignite a powder keg. A powder keg called the Galactic Council. A powder keg that would explode into the war to end all wars, with the survival of humanity hanging in the balance. Chris stepped out of his fighter to a raucous hero's welcome on the tarmac. Pilots and technicians swarmed him, slapping his back and pumping his hand. They chanted his name. Confetti rained down. Chris felt numb, dazed. The adrenaline still surged through his veins. A stern-faced woman in a crisp uniform approached. The crowd parted for her. She carried herself with the bearing of someone used to being obeyed. "Commander Adams, with me now." "Commander?" Chris asked, but she was already striding away. He hurried to catch up. She led him to a Spartan briefing room, empty except for a man sitting ramrod straight at the table. His uniform bristled with medals and ribbons. His face looked hewn from granite, all hard planes and angles. His eyes bored into Chris like laser drills. "Admiral Hawkins, sir." Chris snapped to attention and fired off a salute. "At ease, Commander." The Admiral's voice sounded like gravel in a cement mixer. "You're probably wondering why I've summoned you here." "The thought had crossed my mind, sir." "I'll cut to the chase. That stunt you pulled today was either the ballsiest move I've ever seen or the stupidest. Probably both. I've half a mind to throw you in the brig, but we need men like you now, men with guts, men willing to spit in the eye of death and tell it to fuck off." Chris swallowed. "Why is that, sir?" "Because we're neck-deep in Shit Creek and the current's rising. Our intel boys cracked some Vorkarian transmissions. The Council's planning a full-scale invasion of human space, led by that bastard Zephyr himself." Chris's blood turned to ice in his veins. "Can we stop them?" Hawkins barked a humorless laugh. "Stop them? Son, they outnumber us 100 to 1. Their ships make ours look like rowboats next to battleships. If they hit us head-on, they'll roll over us like a steamroller over an anthill." "There has to be something we can do," Chris said, hands clenching into fists. "Maybe there is. Our eggheads think they've found a chink in their armor, a weakness we can exploit, but we need more intel to be sure. And that's where you come in." "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to take a team behind enemy lines, scout their positions, gather data on their ships, their weapons, their defenses, anything that we can use against them. It'll be the most dangerous mission of your life. If they catch you, they'll do things to you that'll make you wish you'd never been born. But if you pull it off, you might just give us a fighting chance in this war." Chris took a deep breath. He thought of his family, his friends, everyone he loved, everyone he'd sworn to protect. "I'll do it, sir." "I knew you would, Commander." Hawkins stood and clapped him on the shoulder. "Assemble your team. You ship out at 0600, and may God have mercy on us all." Chris saluted and spun on his heel. His mind raced as he strode from the room. He had a mission now, a purpose, and he'd see it through to the end, no matter the cost. Chris and his team slipped through the shadows of the Galactic Council outpost, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had trained for this moment, honed their skills to a razor's edge, but the reality of infiltrating enemy territory still sent adrenaline surging through their veins. They moved like ghosts, silent and unseen, until they reached the outpost's central command center. Chris hacked the lock with a few deft keystrokes, and they slipped inside. Banks of computer screens glowed in the dim light, displaying schematics and readouts. "There," whispered Liara, Chris's second-in-command. She pointed to a screen showing a massive starbase bristling with weapons. "Nexus Prime. That must be where they're marshalling their invasion fleet." Chris nodded grimly. "Download everything you can. We need to get this intel back to—" The door hissed open. A tall Vorkarian officer strode in, flanked by two guards. His eyes widened as he saw the humans. "Intruders!" he barked, reaching for his sidearm. Chris was faster. He lunged forward, disarming the Vorkarian with a vicious strike to the wrist. The guards raised their weapons, but Liara and the others were already moving. A burst of gunfire, a flash of steel, and the guards crumpled to the floor. Chris hauled the Vorkarian officer up by his collar. "You're coming with us!" They dragged their prisoner back to their hidden ship and strapped him into the interrogation chair. Chris stood before him, arms crossed. "I am Commander Zahn of the Galactic Council," the Vorkarian said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You will release me at once." Chris leaned in close. "Not until you tell us what we want to know. How do we stop your invasion fleet?" Zahn laughed. "You can't. Our ships are linked by a central AI network. It coordinates our every move, makes us unbeatable. You humans don't stand a chance." Chris exchanged a glance with Liara. An AI network, if they could disrupt it somehow. "This network," Chris said, "I'm guessing it's controlled from Nexus Prime." Zahn's eyes narrowed. "You'll never get inside. The security is impenetrable. And even if you did, you'd never find the network core." "We'll see about that." Chris turned to his team. "Prep the ship. We're going to Nexus Prime." But as they made their plans, doubt gnawed at Chris. Zahn was right. Infiltrating Nexus Prime would be suicide. They'd never make it past the security, let alone find the network core, not without help from the inside. He turned back to Zahn. "What if I told you that your precious council is lying to you? That their real plan is to subjugate every race in the galaxy, not just humans?" Zahn scoffed. "Impossible. The council brings order and stability." "Does it? Or does it bring tyranny and oppression?" Chris held Zahn's gaze. "Help us, Zahn. Help us stop this war before it's too late, for all our sakes." Zahn looked away, conflict playing across his face. I cannot betray my people." "You wouldn't be betraying them. You'd be saving them from a war that will consume us all." A long silence stretched between them. Then finally Zahn let out a heavy sigh. "Very well. I will help you infiltrate Nexus Prime. But if you are lying to me, human, I will kill you myself." Chris nodded. "Understood." He held out his hand. "Welcome to the team, Zahn." As Zahn gripped his hand, Chris felt a flicker of hope amid the looming darkness. With Zahn's help, they might just pull this off. They might just change the course of history. If they didn't die trying. Chris tugged at the collar of his stolen Vorkarian technician uniform. It chafed against his neck, too tight in all the wrong places. But it was a small price to pay for infiltrating Nexus Prime. The starbase loomed before them, a massive construct of gleaming metal and pulsing lights. Zahn led the way, his steps confident, his bearing that of a Vorkarian officer. The guards waved them through without a second glance. Inside, the starbase buzzed with activity. Vorkarian soldiers marched through the halls, their boots clicking against the polished floors. Technicians hunched over consoles, their fingers flying across the keys. Chris and his team kept their heads down, blending in with the bustle. They reached the central AI core without incident. It was a cavernous room, dominated by a towering spire of servers and blinking lights. Chris pulled the virus from his pocket, a small data chip that held the key to humanity's salvation. He stepped forward to insert it into the main console. "Hold it right there," a voice boomed from behind them. Chris spun around. His blood turned to ice in his veins. Admiral Zephyr stood in the doorway, flanked by a squad of elite guards. His eyes blazed with fury. "Did you really think you could sneak aboard my starbase undetected?" Zephyr sneered. "Your primitive human technology is no match for our sensors." Chris raised his chin. "We're here to stop your invasion, to protect our people from your tyranny." Zephyr laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Your people? You mean those weak, pathetic creatures that scurry about on their backwater planets? They are beneath us, beneath the Galactic Council. We will crush them like the insects they are." Anger surged through Chris's veins. He stepped forward, his fists clenched. "If we're so weak, then face me in single combat. Prove your superiority." Zephyr's eyes narrowed. "You dare challenge me, human?" "I do. By the ancient laws of Vorkarian honor, the victor's demands must be met. If I win, you call off the invasion." For a long moment, Zephyr was silent. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "Very well, I accept your challenge. Prepare to die with honor, human." The guards formed a ring around them, a makeshift arena. Chris shed his technician disguise, revealing the combat suit beneath. Zahn tossed him a Vorkarian pulse blade, a wicked-looking weapon that crackled with energy. Zephyr drew his own blade, the metal gleaming in the harsh light. They circled each other, eyes locked, muscles tensed. Zephyr struck first, a lightning-fast slash that Chris barely parried. The pulse blades clashed, sparks flying. Chris countered with a low sweep, but Zephyr leaped over it with inhuman agility. They traded blows back and forth, the air humming with the crackle of energy. Sweat poured down Chris's face, but he didn't dare blink. Zephyr was fast, strong, a master of the blade, but Chris had a few tricks up his sleeve. He feinted left, then spun right, a move that Zahn had drilled into him during their training sessions. Zephyr fell for it, his blade slicing empty air. Chris lunged forward, his own blade slipping past Zephyr's guard to score a shallow cut across the Admiral's chest. Zephyr roared in pain and anger. He redoubled his assault, his blade a blur of light. Chris gave ground, his arms aching with the effort of parrying the furious blows, but he saw his opening. As Zephyr raised his blade for a crushing overhead strike, Chris dropped and rolled. He came up behind Zephyr, his blade poised at the Admiral's throat. "Yield!" he growled. Zephyr went still. The room held its breath, then slowly Zephyr lowered his blade. "I yield," he said through gritted teeth. Chris stepped back, his heart pounding. He turned to the watching soldiers and technicians. "By the laws of Vorkarian honor, my demands must be met. The invasion is called off. Humanity is to be recognized as an equal partner in the Galactic Council." Zephyr glared at him, hatred burning in his eyes. "This is not over, human. You have won this battle, but the war is far from over." Chris met his gaze unflinchingly. "We'll be ready for you. Humanity doesn't back down from a fight." As he turned to rejoin his team, Chris allowed himself a small smile. They had done it. Against all odds, they had struck a blow for humanity. The road ahead would be long and hard, but they had taken the first step. And he would be there to lead the way every step of it. The news of Chris's stunning victory over Admiral Zephyr spread like wildfire through the galaxy. Whispers turned to shouts, and shouts turned to roars. On 100 worlds, the downtrodden and the oppressed looked to the stars with new hope in their hearts. If a human could best one of the Council's most feared warriors, then perhaps their own shackles could be broken as well. In the halls of power on Nexus Prime, that hope took on a different form: fear. The Council had always been a fractious alliance, held together more by the threat of Vorkarian might than any true sense of unity. Now, with their supposed invincibility shattered, the cracks began to show. "This is an outrage!" The Keldorian ambassador slammed his fist on the table. "We were promised a swift victory, not this humiliation." "Agreed," the Novalian representative chimed in. "If the humans can defy us, what's to stop our own people from getting ideas?" The Vorkarian councillors bristled, their scales rippling with barely contained rage. But before they could respond, a new voice cut through the din. "Ideas are the least of your concerns." The room fell silent as a figure strode into the chamber, flanked by a cohort of heavily armed Vorkarian guards. His battle-scarred face was twisted into a sneer of contempt. General Karos, the Vorkarian Prime Councillor, rose to his feet, his expression wary. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Karos barked a harsh laugh. "Intrusion. I come to save you from your own spinelessness. While you cower and squabble, the humans make a mockery of our power." "Admiral Zephyr fought with honor," the Prime Councillor said stiffly. "He made a pact. We are bound to uphold it." "Honor?" Karos spat the word like venom. "There is no honor in defeat, no glory in capitulation. Zephyr was a weak fool, and his pact dies with him." The Prime Councillor's eyes widened. "Dies? What have you done, Karos?" The General's smile was a hideous thing, all fangs and malice. "What you lacked the spine to do. I have assumed control of the Council, and the invasion will proceed as planned. The humans will burn, and any who stand with them will share their fate." He turned his baleful gaze on the assembled ambassadors, who shrank back in their seats. "As for the rest of you, pray that your loyalties do not waver, for if they do, you will find the Vorkarian memory long and our claws sharp." With that, he spun on his heel and stalked from the room, leaving stunned silence in his wake. Light years away, in the heart of human space, Chris stepped off his ship to a scene of jubilant chaos. Crowds thronged the spaceport, waving flags and shouting his name. Soldiers snapped to attention as he passed, their faces alight with pride. It was everything he had ever dreamed of, the accolades of his people, the respect of his peers. But even as he drank it in, a shadow fell across his heart. They had struck a blow against the Council, true, but it was a fleeting victory, he knew, a single battle in a war that had only just begun. His fears were confirmed mere hours later, in a somber briefing with Admiral Hawkins and the Terran High Command. "The Vorkarians have repudiated Zephyr's agreement," Hawkins said grimly. "A hardliner named Karos has seized power in a coup. He's vowed to crush us, utterly and completely." Chris felt a cold knot form in his gut. "How long do we have?" "Days, a week at most." Hawkins shook his head. "Our defenses are already stretched thin, and their forces are vast. If they come at us head-on—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew the odds. The Terran fleet was formidable, but against the full might of the Galactic Council, they would be little more than a speed bump. "There has to be another way," Chris said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Some weakness we can exploit, some—" And then it hit him. A crazy, impossible idea, but crazy and impossible seemed to be the order of the day. "The other races," he said slowly. "The ones the Council has ground under their heel. If we could convince them to fight with us?" Hawkins' eyebrows shot up. "A coalition against the Vorkarians? It's never been done." "But it could be. Think about it. We're not the only ones with a grudge against the Council. The Keldorians, the Novalians, a dozen others, they all have reason to want the Vorkarians taken down a peg." "And you think they'll listen to you?" Hawkins asked skeptically. "A human?" Chris squared his shoulders. "I think they'll listen to the man who beat Zephyr, the man who showed the galaxy that the Council isn't invincible." He met Hawkins's gaze, his eyes blazing with determination. "Let me try, sir. Let me build this alliance. Because if we can't, then we're all just waiting for the end." For a long moment, Hawkins was silent. Then slowly he nodded. "All right, Commander, you've pulled off the impossible before. Let's see if you can do it again." Chris saluted, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. He had his mission. Now he just had to hope that he could pull it off. Because if he couldn't, then the Vorkarians would be the least of humanity's worries. Chris stood on the bridge of his ship, staring out at the swirling vortex of hyperspace. Behind him, his crew worked in tense silence, their faces drawn with the weight of their task. They had departed human space just hours ago, the cheers of the crowd still ringing in their ears. But there was no jubilation now, only a grim determination to see their mission through. Their first stop was Keldoria, a once proud world brought low by Vorkarian occupation. Chris had studied their history, their culture, seeking any leverage he could find. He found it in the tale of the Keldorian hero Raznak, who had led a rebellion against the Vorkarians centuries ago. Though he had been martyred in the end, his memory still burned bright in the hearts of his people. It was this memory that Chris invoked, as he stood before the Keldorian High Council, his voice ringing with passion. "I come to you not as a conqueror, but as a friend," he said, "a friend who knows the pain of oppression, the sting of subjugation. For too long the Vorkarians have held sway over us all, grinding us beneath their heel." He met the eyes of each councillor in turn, holding their gaze. But no more. The time has come to cast off our chains, to rise up and reclaim our destiny, just as Raznak did, all those years ago. A murmur rippled through the chamber at the mention of the legendary hero. Chris pressed on, his voice growing stronger. "Alone we are weak, alone we will fall, but together we have a chance to build a new galactic order, one based not on fear and tyranny, but on cooperation and mutual respect." He spread his hands, a plea and a promise all in one. "I ask you now, as one free people to another, will you stand with us? Will you fight for a future worth believing in?" For a moment there was silence. Then, one by one, the councillors rose to their feet. Some nodded solemnly, others pounded their chests in the Keldorian gesture of solidarity. And as Chris looked out over the sea of determined faces, he felt a flicker of hope amid the gathering darkness. One world down, a dozen more to go. But for the first time, the impossible seemed just a little bit closer to possible. Chris and his team returned from their diplomatic mission, exhausted but triumphant. The Zirian Confederation had pledged their support, a development that sent shockwaves through the Terran fleet. The Zirians were known for their advanced technology, and their alliance was a game-changer. In a briefing room packed with top military brass, Chris laid out the details of the agreement. "The Zirians have agreed to share their weaponry and tactical knowledge with us. Their plasma cannons and shield generators are light years ahead of anything we have." Admiral Hawkins leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "And what do they want in return?" "A seat at the table," Chris replied. "They want to be recognized as equals in the new galactic order we're trying to build." Hawkins nodded slowly. "A small price to pay for their help, but even with their technology we're still outmatched by the Council's forces." Chris smiled grimly. "That's where our new plan comes in." He tapped a button, and a holographic display sprang to life in the center of the room. "Our spies have located a secret Vorkarian weapons facility deep in their territory. Intel suggests that General Karos is there overseeing the development of a new superweapon." A murmur of unease rippled through the room. The destruction of a planet was no small threat. "We need to take out that facility before they can finish the weapon," Chris continued. "And if we can capture Karos in the process, we'll deal a crippling blow to the Council's leadership." Hawkins studied the hologram, his jaw set. "It's a risky plan. We'll be flying into the heart of enemy territory with no backup." "That's where the Zirians come in," Chris said. "They've agreed to provide a strike force to join us in the attack. With their ships and weapons by our side, we'll have a fighting chance." Hawkins was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, Commander. You have a go. Assemble your team and coordinate with the Zirians. Let's show the Council what happens when they mess with humanity." The strike force assembled in the hangar bay, a mix of human and Zirian ships bristling with weapons. Chris stood before them, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "Today we strike a blow for freedom," he said, his voice ringing out over the assembled warriors. "Today we show the Council that their reign of terror is over. We fight not just for humanity, but for all the races who have suffered under their yoke." A cheer went up from the crowd, a roar of defiance and determination. Chris climbed into his ship, his hands steady on the controls. "All wings, report in." One by one the pilots checked in, their voices crackling over the comm. Red Leader standing by. Blue Squadron ready to fly. Xerian Strike Force armed and ready. Chris took a deep breath. All ships launch. The hangar doors slid open, and the strike force roared out into space, a glittering swarm of metal and purpose. They flew in tight formation, the Xerian ships interspersed with the human fighters, their alien designs a stark contrast to the familiar lines of the Terran craft. As they approached the coordinates of the weapons facility, Chris's sensor board lit up with warnings. We've got incoming. Looks like they were expecting us. The space around them erupted with laser fire and missiles as Vorkarian ships swarmed to meet them. The strike force broke formation, the pilots engaging their targets with grim determination. Chris jinked and wove through the chaos, his weapons spitting fire. A Vorkarian fighter exploded under his guns, then another, but for every ship they destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. We're taking heavy losses, a voice shouted over the comm. We can't hold them off much longer. Stay focused, Chris barked. We need to punch through to that facility. A squadron of Xerian ships formed up around Chris's fighter, their plasma cannons raking the enemy with searing beams of energy. Together, they carved a path through the Vorkarian defenses, the facility looming before them like a malevolent spider. There's a power core at the heart of the base, Chris said. If we can destroy it, the whole place will go up in flames. We'll cover you, the Xerian commander replied. Get in there and end this. Chris gunned his engines, diving towards the facility with a small team of elite soldiers. They blasted their way through the outer defenses and plunged into the heart of the base. The corridors were eerily empty, the only sound the clank of their boots on the metal floor. Then a door slid open, and they found themselves face to face with General Karos himself. The Vorkarian general was a towering figure, his scales gleaming in the harsh light. "You dare to attack us here, human," he snarled. "You will pay for your insolence with your lives." Chris raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. "It's over, Karos. Surrender now, and you may yet live to see trial." Karos threw back his head and laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Surrender? To the likes of you, I would rather die." He lunged forward, his claws slashing at Chris's face. Chris dodged aside, his weapon forgotten as he grappled with the Vorkarian. They crashed against the walls, snarling and clawing at each other with brutal ferocity. Around them, Chris's team fought with the Vorkarian guards who had emerged from the shadows. Laser fire and screams filled the air, the stench of blood and burnt flesh thick in Chris's nostrils. With a final, desperate effort, Chris managed to get his hands around Karos's throat. He squeezed with all his strength, feeling the Vorkarian's windpipe collapse under his fingers. Karos's eyes bulged, his claws scrabbling weakly at Chris's arms. "You may have defeated me," he gasped, "but you're too late. The weapon is already primed, targeted, at your precious Earth." Chris felt a cold hand of fear close around his heart. He dropped Karos's body and sprinted for the control room, his team close on his heels. If the Vorkarian was telling the truth, then they had only minutes to stop the weapon from firing. And if they failed, then everything they had fought for would be lost and Earth would burn. Chris burst onto the bridge of the Terran Fleet command ship, his heart pounding. "Admiral Hawkins, the weapon is primed and targeted at Earth. We have to evacuate immediately." Hawkins' face paled. He slammed his fist on the intercom button. "Attention all ships. Initiate planetary evacuation protocol Alpha 1. I repeat, initiate planetary evacuation protocol Alpha 1. This is not a drill." Klaxons blared throughout the ship as the crew scrambled to action. On the view screen, a fleet of transport vessels began to descend towards Earth's surface, ready to ferry civilians to safety. But Chris knew it wouldn't be enough. There were billions of people down there, and the Vorkarian superweapon would fire in a matter of hours. They needed more time. "Sir, we can't evacuate everyone," he said urgently. "But I have an idea. The Xerians gave us the technology to create an energy shield around the planet. It could withstand the blast." Hawkins frowned. "The power requirements for a shield that size would be astronomical. We don't have anything capable of generating that much energy." "Yes, we do." Chris pulled up a schematic on the screen. There's a Xerian power station in orbit around Jupiter. If we can get there and activate the generator, we can channel the energy to the shield. Hawkins studied the schematic, his brow furrowed. It's a long shot, and even if it works, the station will be a sitting duck when the weapon fires. Chris met his gaze steadily. I'll go, sir. I'll take a team and activate the generator manually. That's a suicide mission, Commander. You won't have time to get clear before the blast hits. I know, Chris swallowed hard, but it's our only chance. We have to try. For a long moment, Hawkins was silent. Then he nodded grimly. Godspeed, Commander. Bring our people home. Chris saluted sharply, then turned to his team. Zahn, Mikhailov, Sato, you're with me. Grab your gear and meet me in the hangar bay in 5. As they raced through the corridors of the ship, Chris's mind was already racing ahead, plotting their course through the Vorkarian blockade that surrounded Earth. They would have to fight their way through, but with the advanced Xerian ships at their disposal, they had a chance. In the hangar bay, Chris strapped himself into the pilot's seat of a sleek Xerian fighter, its hull gleaming under the harsh lights. Zahn took the co-pilot's chair beside him, his face set with grim determination. Never thought I'd be flying into battle alongside a human, the Vorkarian muttered. Chris managed a tight smile. First time for everything. He punched the thrusters, and the fighter leapt forward, screaming out of the hangar bay and into the void of space. Behind them, the rest of the strike team formed up in tight formation. As they approached the Vorkarian blockade, Chris's sensors lit up with incoming fire. Evasive maneuvers, he barked. Mikhailov, Sato, keep those fighters off our backs. The space around them erupted into a maelstrom of laser fire and missiles as the strike team wove through the Vorkarian defenses. Chris gritted his teeth as he jinked and rolled, his fingers flying over the controls. A Vorkarian cruiser loomed before them, its guns swiveling to track their approach. Chris didn't hesitate. He fired a salvo of torpedoes, watching in grim satisfaction as they slammed into the cruiser's hull, sending gouts of flame and debris spiraling into space. Punch a hole through their lines, he ordered. We've got to reach that power station. The strike team surged forward, their weapons blazing. One by one, the Vorkarian ships fell before them, until at last they broke through the blockade and into open space. The power station hung before them, a gleaming spire of metal and energy. Chris brought the fighter in close, searching for a docking port. There. Zahn pointed to a small airlock on the station's side. Chris nodded and brought the fighter in, wincing as the hull scraped against the station's surface. They were running out of time. The moment the airlock sealed behind them, Chris was out of his seat and racing towards the generator room, his team close on his heels. They burst through the doors, weapons drawn, only to find the room empty. Zahn, get that generator online, Chris ordered. Mikhailov, Sato, watch the doors. We can't let anyone stop us now. The Vorkarian nodded and hurried to the generator controls, his fingers flying over the panels. Chris watched the countdown on his wrist display tick down with agonizing slowness. Suddenly, the station shuddered violently, throwing them all to the floor. Chris staggered to his feet, his heart in his throat. The weapon! Sato shouted. It's firing! On the view screen, a blinding lance of energy erupted from the Vorkarian superweapon, hurtling towards Earth with terrifying speed. Chris watched, his breath caught in his throat as it slammed into the planet's atmosphere and dissipated harmlessly against the shimmering energy shield that sprang to life around the globe. A cheer went up from the strike team as they watched the shield hold steady against the onslaught. They had done it. They had saved Earth. But their celebration was short-lived. The station shuddered again, more violently this time, as the shockwave from the blast slammed into its hull. We've got to get out of here, Chris shouted over the blaring alarms. Everyone to the escape pods now. They raced through the crumbling corridors of the station, dodging falling debris and exploding consoles. Chris slammed his fist on the door of the nearest escape pod, ushering his team inside. But as he turned to follow them, a massive girder crashed down from the ceiling, blocking his path. Chris strained against it, but it wouldn't budge. "Commander," Zahn's voice crackled over the comm, "we have to go." Chris closed his eyes for a moment, his heart heavy. "Go," he said softly. "Get yourselves to safety, that's an order." "But, sir—" "Go," Chris roared. "I'll find another way out." He watched as the escape pod blasted away from the station, carrying his team to safety. Then he turned and ran, searching desperately for another way off the disintegrating station. But everywhere he turned, he found only dead ends and collapsed passages. The station was coming apart around him, and he was trapped. Chris slumped against a wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had known this was a one-way trip, but somehow he had always imagined going out in a blaze of glory, not trapped and alone on a dying space station. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small holoprojector. With a shaking hand, he activated it, watching as an image of his family sprang to life before him. His wife, her eyes shining with love and pride. His daughter, her face split in a wide, gap-toothed grin. His son, so serious and solemn in his cadet's uniform. "I'm sorry," Chris whispered, his vision blurring with tears. "I'm so sorry." He closed his eyes, waiting for the end. But instead of the searing heat of an explosion, he felt a sudden wrenching jolt. His eyes flew open, and he found himself tumbling end over end through space, the escape pod's harness digging into his chest. Somehow, impossibly, Zahn had managed to circle back and snatch him from the jaws of death at the last possible moment. As the pod hurtled towards Earth's surface, Chris let out a shaky laugh. He was alive, battered, bruised, and utterly spent, but alive. And Earth was safe. The Vorkarian superweapon was destroyed, and the Council's invasion had been thwarted. There would be a reckoning, Chris knew, a settling of accounts with the Vorkarian hardliners who had led them to this brink. But for now he let himself sink into the blessed embrace of unconsciousness, the image of his family still glowing in his mind's eye. He had done his duty. He had saved his world. And for a weary soldier, that was enough. Chris groaned as the escape pod slammed into the Earth's surface, the impact throwing him against the harness. The pod's advanced safety systems had managed to keep them alive, but he could feel the bruises forming already. He glanced around at his crew, checking for injuries. Zahn was rubbing his neck, wincing but otherwise seemed unharmed. The others were shaken but intact. With a hiss of hydraulics, the pod's hatch opened, revealing a scene of utter devastation. The once proud cityscape was in ruins, buildings toppled and fires raging unchecked. Above, the energy shield crackled and pulsed, a shimmering barrier against the chaos beyond. "We need to move," Chris said, unstrapping himself from his seat. "The evacuation's still underway, and there are going to be a lot of scared, desperate people out there." They clambered out of the pod, picking their way through the rubble-strewn streets. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid tang of burning metal. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of battle, the chatter of gunfire and the deep, bone-shaking rumble of explosions. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a group of Vorkarian soldiers, their reptilian features twisted in snarls of rage. Chris and his team reacted instantly, diving for cover and returning fire. The air was filled with the sizzle of laser bolts and the sharp, percussive crack of human weapons. "Flank them!" Chris shouted, popping up from behind a shattered wall to take aim at a Vorkarian heavy weapon emplacement. His shots found their mark, and the gunner toppled backwards, his chest a smoking ruin. Zahn and the others moved up, leapfrogging from cover to cover as they pressed the attack. The Vorkarians fought with the desperate ferocity of cornered animals, but they were outmatched and outflanked. One by one they fell, until the street was littered with their broken bodies. "We can't stay here," Chris said, reloading his weapon. "We need to keep moving, find any survivors we can, and get them to safety." They pushed on, fighting their way through pockets of Vorkarian resistance and gathering up terrified civilians as they went. Some were too frightened to move, huddling in the ruins of their homes, but others joined them, picking up weapons from fallen foes and forming a ragtag militia. In orbit, the battle raged on, the Terran fleet and their Xerian allies throwing everything they had at the Vorkarian armada. The superweapon hung in space like a malevolent eye, its maw glowing with destructive energy. But the Allied ships were relentless, hammering at its defenses with a barrage of missiles and laser fire. Finally, with a blinding flash of light, the superweapon exploded, ripped apart from within by a critical overload. The Vorkarian flagship, caught in the blast, spun out of control, its hull shattered and burning. The invaders were in disarray, their formations broken and their ships fleeing before the Allied onslaught. On the ground, Chris's comm crackled to life. "Commander, we've got a situation at the spaceport. A Vorkarian general is leading an assault, trying to cut off the evacuation. We need you there now." Chris grimaced. The spaceport was the city's last lifeline, the only way to get the remaining civilians off planet. If the Vorkarians took it, they'd have a foothold on Earth, and the evacuation would be doomed. "On our way," he said, gesturing to his team. "Let's move." They fought their way through the city, rallying scattered groups of human defenders as they went. The spaceport loomed ahead, a vast complex of landing pads and cargo bays, swarming with Vorkarian troops. Chris could see civilians huddled in the main terminal, waiting desperately for rescue. "We'll need to hit them hard and fast," he said, surveying the battlefield. "Zahn, take your team and secure the perimeter. The rest of you with me. We're going straight for the terminal." With a roar of defiance, they charged forward, weapons blazing. The Vorkarian elite guard met them head-on, their energy shields sparking under the onslaught. Chris ducked and weaved, his rifle spitting fire, as he pushed towards the terminal entrance. A Vorkarian general emerged from the chaos, his armor gleaming in the sunlight. He was a massive brute, towering over the human soldiers, his eyes glinting with malice. Chris squared off against him, circling warily, looking for an opening. The general lunged, his energy blade slashing through the air. Chris parried, the force of the blow numbing his arm, but he held his ground. They traded blows, moving faster than the eye could follow, their weapons clashing in showers of sparks. With a final desperate effort, Chris managed to slip past the general's guard, his blade finding the weak point in the Vorkarian's armor. The general stiffened, his eyes widening in shock, then toppled backwards, his lifeblood pooling on the ground. Chris stood over his fallen foe, breathing heavily. Around him the battle was winding down, the last of the Vorkarians being driven back or surrendering. The spaceport was secure, and the evacuation could continue. He looked up at the sky where the energy shield still shimmered, a testament to the sacrifices that had been made. They had won the day, but the cost had been high. Earth would need time to heal, to rebuild from the ashes of war. But for now there was still work to be done. Chris turned to his team, his eyes hard with determination. "Let's get these people to safety," he said. "We've got a planet to save." The battle-scarred streets of Earth faded into the background as Chris and his crew embarked on their next mission. The Vorkarian forces were in full retreat, their once mighty armada reduced to scattered remnants fleeing back to their homeworld. But even as the humans celebrated their hard-fought victory, news reached them of the chaos engulfing the Vorkarian Empire. "Civil war," Zahn said grimly, his eyes scanning the intelligence reports. "The Vorkarian factions are tearing each other apart, fighting for control in the power vacuum left by Karos's defeat." Chris nodded, his mind already racing with the possibilities. "This could be our chance," he said. "With the Galactic Council fractured and the Vorkarians fighting among themselves, we might never have a better opportunity to strike a decisive blow." He turned to the holographic display, where the leaders of the Terran fleet and their new allies, the Xerian Confederation, were gathered. "We need to hit them hard and fast," he said. "Coordinated attacks on their key strongholds, aiming to liberate the oppressed races and establish a new galactic order." The Xerian commander, a tall, elegant figure with shimmering silver skin, nodded in agreement. "Our forces are ready, Admiral," she said. "Together we can bring an end to the Council's tyranny once and for all." And so the campaign began, with Chris leading the charge. He threw himself into the fight with a fierce determination, his tactical brilliance and unwavering resolve inspiring his troops to new heights of courage and sacrifice. They struck at the heart of the Council's power, liberating planet after planet, freeing the enslaved races and rallying them to their cause. But the war was far from easy. The Council forces, though weakened and divided, fought with the desperate ferocity of cornered beasts. The battles were brutal and bloody, with countless lives lost on both sides. Entire worlds were left in ruins, their populations decimated, and their ecosystems ravaged by the relentless fighting. Through it all, Chris pushed forward, driven by a sense of duty and a burning desire to see justice done. But even he could not escape the toll of the war. He watched friends and comrades fall in battle, their sacrifices etched forever in his memory. He saw the haunted look in the eyes of the civilians they liberated, the scars of a lifetime of oppression and fear. And then came the final battle, the assault on the Galactic Council's capital world. Chris led the charge, his flagship at the head of a vast armada of human, Xyrian and allied ships. They clashed with the last remnants of the Vorkarian Old Guard, a bitter and vengeful force led by none other than Admiral Zephyr himself. So the battle was a maelstrom of fire and destruction, with ships torn apart and warriors falling on both sides. Chris found himself face to face with Zephyr on the surface of the planet, their hatred for each other burning hot as the stars. They fought with a savage intensity, trading blows that would have felled lesser beings. In the end, Chris emerged victorious, standing over Zephyr's broken body as the last of the Vorkarian resistance crumbled around them. But his triumph was short-lived. He turned to see Commander Zahn, his friend and ally, lying mortally wounded, having thrown himself in front of a blow meant for Chris. "Why?" Chris asked, cradling Zahn's head in his lap, tears stinging his eyes. Zahn coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Because you're the one who can lead us forward," he said. "You're the one who can build a better future for all of us." With Zahn's death, the war was finally over. The Galactic Council was defeated, its power broken forever. The allied races came together to forge a new government, one based on the principles of equality, cooperation, and mutual respect that Chris had fought so hard to uphold. But for Chris himself, the scars of the war ran deep. He was haunted by the losses he had suffered, the friends he had buried, the horrors he had witnessed. And so, even as the galaxy celebrated its newfound freedom, he made the difficult decision to step down from his role as leader. He returned to Earth, to the war-torn remains of the world he had fought so hard to save. There, among the ruins and the rebuilding, he sought to find some measure of peace, some solace in the simple life he had once known. The galaxy may have been free, but for Chris, the memories of the war would never fade. The scars it had left on his soul would never fully heal, but he took comfort in the knowledge that his sacrifices, and the sacrifices of all those who had fought and died alongside him, had not been in vain. They had won their freedom, and they had built a better future for all the generations to come. Chris stared out at the ruins of what had once been a thriving city. Rubble and debris were strewn across the street, crunching under his boots as he walked. He ducked through the doorway of a collapsed building, taking in the scorched walls and shattered windows. This had been someone's home once, someone's life. Now it was just another casualty of the war. He heard a soft whimper from behind a pile of twisted metal. Carefully, he picked his way through the wreckage to find a small child huddled in the corner, her clothes tattered and her face streaked with tears. Chris knelt down beside her, reaching out a gentle hand. "Hey there," he said softly. "It's okay, you're safe now." The child looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Chris felt a pang in his chest. How many more like her were out there, lost and alone in the ruins of their world? He scooped the girl up in his arms and carried her out into the sunlight. Everywhere he looked, he saw signs of the devastation the war had wrought. Buildings reduced to rubble, streets choked with debris, people huddled in makeshift shelters, their eyes haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. Chris threw himself into the rebuilding efforts, working tirelessly alongside his fellow survivors to clear the rubble and establish some semblance of order. But even as they worked, Chris could feel the weight of the memories pressing down on him. The faces of the friends he had lost, the choices he had been forced to make, the horrors he had seen. At night, he would wake in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, and his mind racing with visions of the battles he had fought. He wasn't the only one. He saw the same haunted look in the eyes of the other survivors, the same flinch at sudden noises, the same restless pacing in the dark hours of the night. The war had left scars on all of them, scars that went deeper than the physical wounds they bore. As he struggled to find his place in this new world, Chris received an unexpected visit. A sleek Xyrian shuttle landed on the outskirts of the city, and a delegation of diplomats emerged, their silver skin glinting in the sunlight. "Admiral Chris," the lead diplomat said, bowing deeply, "we come bearing urgent news." Chris led them to a makeshift conference room, where they laid out the situation. The fragile peace established after the war was already beginning to unravel. Various factions and splinter groups were vying for power in the vacuum left by the Galactic Council's defeat, threatening to plunge the galaxy back into chaos. "We need your help, Admiral," the diplomat said. "Your unique perspective, your moral compass. The galaxy needs a leader like you now more than ever." Chris felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Part of him longed for the simplicity of a life on Earth, free from the burdens of leadership and the horrors of war. But another part of him knew that he could not turn his back on the galaxy he had fought so hard to save. He thought of Zahn, of the sacrifice his friend had made for the cause of freedom. He thought of the countless others who had given their lives so that others might live free. Could he really walk away from that legacy? In the end, there was only one choice he could make. With a heavy heart, Chris bid farewell to Earth once more, knowing that he might never return. He boarded the Xyrian shuttle and set out to navigate the treacherous waters of galactic politics, ready to take up the mantle of leadership once more. As the shuttle broke through the atmosphere and into the star-studded expanse of space, Chris felt a sense of purpose settle over him. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, that the cost of peace might be even higher than the cost of war. But he also knew that he could not turn his back on the galaxy he had sworn to protect. He carried with him the memories of those he had lost, the hard lessons learned through blood and sacrifice. They would be his compass, his guiding light in the darkness. And as he stepped onto the bridge of his new flagship, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew that he would honor their legacy, no matter the cost. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.